Yep,
Okay.
looks like we're up. All right, well, welcome everybody. This is a live 2025 hurricane season forecast, and I'll be bringing this to you with Sebastian Weather Channel.
What is up, everybody?
So in this stream, we're going to be discussing a variety of different things that could be um, impacting this hurricane season, and what regions could be seeing the worst of the impacts.
Yeah, well, again, well, it might not be the most active season. Like, I'm not saying below average. While it might not be the most hyperactive season that we've seen, it is going to be very. It only takes one storm, and it will be very interesting for areas that have not seen a lot of activity recently. It's really only been like Tampa, the Florida Big Bend, and stuff, and Louisiana, and say Mexico. But this year, a lot of areas that haven't been affected in a while. Even if you've been close to a hurricane, you could be at a much higher risk this year, especially for areas that don't usually get the tropical cyclones.
Mm-hmm. All right, so now we can get started with the video. So let's first take a look at our El Nino Southern Oscillation um, forecast here. So as you can see, where we are now in January, a La Nina is favored, but as time progresses, you can see right here that neutral becomes a greater and greater probability, especially as we move into April and May. And then as we start heading into the summer, you can see that La Nina probability also is starting to catch up. And you can see all the way in August, it's even slightly favored that we could see a La Nina again towards the middle to end of hurricane season. So that could be interesting because typically La Nina years can bring warmer temperatures in the Atlantic Ocean as well as lower wind shear.
Yeah, and and the La Nina chances have gone up, and so definitely higher risks. So definitely the risk could be higher getting towards peak of the season as you see the La Nina chances get higher, mainly towards the peak.
Mm-hmm. All right, so next we're going to take a look at what a neutral phase looks like uh, for both the Atlantic and Pacific. So as you can see, over here in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific, kind of to the west of of the Mexican coastline, it's generally more normal activity. So it's not leaning it's not leaning above or below average. It's more just near normal, as it says. And the same goes for the Central Pacific to the south, closer to Ecuador, kind of near the equator region. You can see it's going to be a bit cooler, which means below normal water temperatures there.
Um, yeah, and then as we get into a La Nina, more hurricanes are going to happen due to less vertical wind shear and less trade winds and less atmospheric stability, which can bring more storms towards the East Coast and the Gulf of Mexico.
Mm-hmm. Just to simplify it, during a La Nina means more hurricanes in the Atlantic and fewer hurricanes in the Eastern Pacific, generally.
Yeah.
So, do you want
Um.
to talk about this one?
Yeah. So this is the average sea surface temperatures based on the analogs that we're going to be using later in the video. So while we do not see widespread above average sea surface temperatures, that could change. Again, as long as we have like we due to a La Nina, we could be seeing less favorable, less shear, which we will get to in a second. That could already mean more tropical storms and hurricanes. And even if they're only tropical storms and don't reach hurricane status, they could be prosperous. And also, a lot of these systems, due to less wind shear, could strengthen a lot more. Though, even though we do see a lot of areas, we see some with some above average sea surface temperatures. Now, these are just for the analogs we're using. A lot of the climatology models have shown very above average sea surface temperatures, so that's one of the more uncertain topics. But either way, due to less wind shear, we could be seeing a more active season.
Yep. Now, moving on, this is a model depicting the wind shear in the Atlantic, and as you can see, a very large area of below average wind shear, notably over the Caribbean and southern Gulf of Mexico. And then along the east coast, You can see just about near normal wind shear, as well as in the northern Gulf of Mexico.
Yes.
So in general,
Um,
that's very favorable for hurricane development in those areas. Because
I will.
sorry, you
I
can
will
go.
say. Sorry, I will say that due to above average wind shear you can see in most of the MDR, we can still see a lot of systems due to the fact that there is below average shear everywhere else. But that can push storms more north, which means more eastern Gulf and east coast systems rather than western Gulf systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because generally those storm tracks, when storms head through the MDR, they typically would move this way and would eventually enter the Caribbean, and then they could potentially impact the Gulf Coast, anywhere over here, the Yucatan, Central America, etc. But those storm tracks that are generally more north, up here where this wind shear is lower, generally like to follow up the coastline here. And of course, a lot of storms typically will go offshore further. You can sometimes get those storms that move closer to the coastline, and during those storms, impacts to the east coast of the U.S., including Florida sometimes, can have a lot of impacts. And even
Yes,
storms that
but
are offshore can also have impacts because of rip currents, etc., large waves. Those can still have impacts on the beach conditions along the coastline.
yeah, and even then, we you don't need a system to make landfall. We also like obviously systems that even are well off coast could have marine impacts, but even storms that are closer, like just off the coast, and they'll expect this, depending on how close they are or if they're a stronger system, could very well bring tropical storm conditions and or more to the coast
Mm-hmm.
and even inland, depending on how big the system is.
So that was for the early season. So this is June, July, and August. And now this model run here is for August, September, and October. And you can see a bit of a notable difference. I'll just flow through them real quick. So this is early season, late season, early season, late season. And as you can see, there is a notable difference along portions of the East Coast, especially in wind shear. You can see it goes from a near normal wind shear to a slightly below average wind shear, which is good for tropical storm and hurricane development, of course. And you could also see that this large area of low wind shear to the north of the MDR does continue. So it does persist. And that kind of shows that storms that do line up in this area could have an easier time forming into tropical cyclones.
Yes.
And now we're going to take a look at the total accumulated precipitation anomaly. So this is for June, and you can see that we do have an area right over here in the southeastern U.S. and
Yes.
even portions of the eastern Gulf of Mexico. It's kind of showing the potential for some above average precipitation there. And you could also see in the MDR, there's also an above average area here, this swath of above average precipitation, which
I
could
will say
indicate the potential for some more tropical wave activity in that area.
I will say that the NMME is not going to be our main thing that's determining our tracks. That's going to be analogs, which we'll get to later. This is just something that we may look at, though.
Mm-hmm.
Usually, in years, the analogs have shown to be the most accurate.
Yeah. So moving on to July for this, you could see a bit of a northern trend in this swath of precipitation in the MDR. So you could see this track, or could this swath could be showing that tracks for those tropical waves could be taking a more northern direction, potentially closer to the east coast. So I would say we'd see a lot of Atlantic recurves here in this area based off this. And also this swath here of precipitation could be saying the tracks would be potentially following a track such as this, showing kind of that North Atlantic recurve type of thing. And same goes
And
for over portions of the mid-Atlantic and even the northern southeast. You can see there's a slightly above average precipitation area, which is slightly notable.
yeah, it could mean that systems are going to be going into the Carolinas and Northeast even in the earlier season.
Mm-hmm. So now let's move on to August. So as you can see, that area over the East Coast and right off the East Coast in the Atlantic does persist, if not gets slightly heavier in regards to precipitation. And you can see this swath going from the MDR to, or kind of up the coast, kind of moves a bit more to the north as well. And this continues to show that potential for those recurves, possibly even up the East Coast or out to sea. Maybe even Bermuda will be an area to watch too.
Yes.
And then also there is
Um.
a slight area of above average over the Northern Caribbean, so that could be showing maybe a storm track could progress that way as well.
Yeah. So really, what I'm seeing here is that a lot of the East Coast storms, and the reason I'm saying that is you do see there um a lot of above average precipitation around the Bahamas, and then the South and North Carolina and the Northeast. So what I really think that could be a thing of is that systems might like hug the East Coast, and then they could make landfall somewhere around the Carolinas into the Northeast.
Such as that track, possibly.
Yes, or one that hits the North Carolina and then into that and like hits the Northeast as well, like an actual landfall. Yeah, something like that.
Hmm. Now let's take a look at September. So you can see a bit of a change along the East Coast in regards to September. You can see it favors a bit more below average of precipitation there, and you can see that along or in that swath from the MDR up, you can see it takes a bit more of a curve to the north, and it kind of shows that as the season progresses, this swath will progress from kind of over the central to northern Caribbean, gradually moving upwards from the east coast and eventually out to sea further. That's kind of the trend that it shows, and I'll actually go backwards a little bit to kind of demonstrate that. So you can see, starting out June, it follows the track down here a bit more. In July, it shifts slightly bit more north here. And then August, you can see it goes even more north, potentially uh, showing the East Coast getting um, some of that activity. And then finally, in September, you can see it continues that shift and goes a lot further out to sea.
Yeah, and then if we can go see that comparison to 2024 real quick, which is the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I want to know now is the 2024. It shows way more about Earth's precipitation, which means that we might be not seeing very hyperactive seasons this year. Though I will want to note out that that showed all the above average precipitation into the Gulf and MDR. This year, most of that, as you saw, was in the Carolinas and in the Northeast. But this year, this 2024 one, we see how there's like really nothing in the Carolinas and Northeast. But this year that is where the main activity seems to be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, as we move on, this is the annual tropical cyclone frequency anomaly. This is over a time period of 1979 to 2014, so it's climatology. Do you want to talk about this one?
Yeah, so basically, this is the main thing I use, and where you're going to use for tracks. They, for the past couple of years, ever since I started using them in 2021, 2022, have been the most accurate. So as we can see, we do see we see a lot of recurves, but that happens every year. I mean, you've never had a year without a lot of recurves, like even 2005, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
recurves. So we have a system that goes. We have a big area that goes Yucatan into Texas and Mexico. I will say though, I that is not because they're going to get a lot of activity. That just means every analog has shown at least one system there. So while Mexico and the Yucatan are probably going to get a system, it's not doesn't mean it's going to be very active. It just means that they'll probably get like one or two systems. The main activity is farther east, where we do see areas that go maybe slightly off the Yucatan towards the Florida Panhandle, which we'll see in the analogs in a second. But the main area where I think the highest risk is going to be is the Bahamas into the Carolinas into New Jersey. We do see a red going from the Bahamas extending up to New Jersey, which might not seem like a lot on this map, but you'll see in a second how. there could be a pretty big risk.
Mm-hmm. So moving on, we're going to take a look at some analogs. So this was 2013. Do you want to talk about this?
Okay, so yeah, we have one going towards the Big Bend in the Florida Panhandle, and then one in the Yucatan into Mexico. So that shows an analog. Now, what we do see here, though, is a system going into the Bahamas towards the East Coast. I do think that can be attractive here. Now, this year is an anomaly. Like it's a good analog, but at the same time, it's not going to be very well representing this year because this year had a lot of tropical depressions and only two hurricanes. This was just a very dead season, and seasons like this where there's only two hurricanes and where there's not even that much tropical storms and most of the system stays tropical depressions, this doesn't happen anymore. So I think if we actually can, these storms are stronger, we could see like that one by the Bahamas would go towards the northeast, or we'd have a strong system there. So really, this is a good analog, though it isn't the most consistent analog. So I would take this one with a grain of salt, as this one it was a very weak season, and while it might be a little good for tracks due to the fact that the season was pretty dead, it's not going to be the best representation of what we're going to see this year.
Mm-hmm. Now moving on, this is 1967. Do you want to talk about this one?
Okay. Yeah, so we do see one hitting the Yucatan in Mexico. So really, the main thing here is we do see a lot off the East Coast. We have stuff going to the Carolinas and basically hitting the Northeast. I will say these tracks are kind of abnormal, though the reason it's an analog is even we do see a lot of recurvatures as we always do. But the East Coast, we have a lot going towards Boston, like Massachusetts, the Carolinas. So while these storm tracks are very abnormal, as you can tell, it does show how the Northeast and the Carolinas are going to be at the biggest risk this year.
Mm-hmm. All right, now moving on, this is 2011.
Do you want to talk about this one?
Sure. So as you can see in 2011, there's a lot of storm tracks here that are at North Atlantic recurves, and you can even see this one that really stands out on the East Coast. And this one was Irene, right?
Yes.
So you can see this was the year that Irene happens, and I'm sure a lot of people along the East Coast, especially the Carolinas, even New Jersey, probably remember this storm. But this one took place in a year in which we saw some similarities with the pattern we could be seeing this year. The general pattern is we'll be seeing a lot of North Atlantic recurves, potentially along the East Coast of the United States. And in this analog, you can really see there's a lot of storms just moving up the East Coast or just up into the North Atlantic. And I feel like this year we're going to be seeing a lot of that activity, just in the North Atlantic in general. And you could also see that in the Gulf of Mexico and the Western Caribbean, there is some activity, but it's a bit less noticeable in comparison to the North Atlantic. So we could be seeing something like that as well this year. Of course, there is definitely some possibility for tropical cyclones there too, especially in regions like the Yucatan and even portions of the Gulf of Mexico.
Yes.
So moving on to
1970.
1970. Do you want to talk about this
Uh,
one?
so 1970. This one abnormally this one has abnormally high Gulf activity, though we do see that Eastern Gulf, Florida Panhandle track I was talking about, and the Yucatan going towards Texas tracks. Don't really think it's going to happen as much this year, but really, what I very interesting here is we have systems getting very close to the Carolinas and Northeast, and that's really going to be a good indication of what we're going to see this year. I think this is a good analog for the Eastern Gulf tracks, as well as these systems that are going towards the Carolinas and the Northeast.
Mm-hmm. And now we're taking a look at the year 2000. So as you can see, another year again with a ton of Atlantic recurves. You can see, just if you look at it, there's a ton of different tracks in that general area. A bit less of an active year for the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, but still some activity like we could be seeing this year. And then also you could see just in general that area we were talking about earlier, which had that above average precipitation swath, is where we're also seeing a lot of these storm tracks starting up. So this general MDR area, and then they head out into
Or
the Caribbean and into the North Atlantic.
Yeah, we do see here a lot off the coast of the East Coast, and we do have a tropical storm that hits the Carolinas, and then another one that hits the Northeast.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not even as a remnant, as an actual storm. So really, definitely something to watch.
Yeah, definitely. And now we're going to take a
Um,
look at the NAO positive phase versus the NAO negative phase. So do you want to talk about this one?
yeah. So I'm thinking we're going to be having a neutral to a slightly positive phase this year, which means that would just make sense because it wouldn't have recurves. It would also have the Eastern Gulf and the East Coast instead of towards the Western Gulf. Now, again, it is impossible to predict NAO phase this far, and in fact, it's probably impossible to predict it for next month. But just with what we're predicting, it would make sense to have a neutral to positive NAO phase this year.
Mm-hmm. And then with that, potentially a positive phase, you could see here, just say a storm set up here in the MDR. You could see that storm track would kind of progress um, potentially into the Caribbean and then up to the North America. It kind of follows that high pressure system and where that's kind of sending those storms because of course they um, tropical cyclones they always follow that clockwise progression around the Bermuda High. And if it does set up similar to this, you can see that those storms would likely set up kind of in the western North Atlantic, kind of as this graphic is shown here. Meanwhile,
Yes.
if we did have a negative phase, you could see that that's a year we would probably have a lot more Gulf activity, such as storms hitting Texas, Louisiana, potentially the Florida Gulf Coast. That's what we'd see in one of those years. But from what we could tell so far, it's looking like this year is more likely to be a positive phase or somewhere in between.
Yes.
So, do you want to talk about this one?
Yeah. So this is we're gonna actually start getting into graphics now. So due to the fact that we are kind of unsure on how warm the sea surface temperature is going to be, probably going to be average, but leaning towards above average, especially those climatology models showing widespread above average temperatures. And due to the lack of shear, but again due to the uncertainty, we're going to have around an average season. But also an equal chance of an above average season due to the fact that we are going to have more um, more shear staying into the Eastern Pacific and the Southern MDR, allowing a lot of these systems, even if they don't strengthen too much, they're going to form. They're be able to form and make long treks across the Atlantic, as well as systems that are able to strengthen very rapidly, and that's why the below average chance is only around 20%.
Mm-hmm. All right. So this is your preliminary 2025 hurricane season forecast. I'll let you talk about this one.
Okay, so again, all of these numbers include below to above average, though each number gives an edge to the above average. So 13 to 16 tropical storms, the average is 14, so a slight edge to above average. So I'm expecting a slightly above average tropical storms. 6 to 9 hurricanes, so average is 7, so slightly above average hurricanes, and 2 to 4 major hurricanes, so about average major hurricanes.
All right. So now moving on, this is Sebastian's forecast for the likely tracks. I'll let you talk about
You
this one as well if you want.
Okay. So again, we have that Yucatan, Texas track, as I was talking about, and that one that goes into the Florida Panhandle area, and then we have the two recurvatures. But these main two tracks I'm interested in is, as we saw in the 1967 season, a lot of abnormal tracks that were unusually far north. We could be seeing that this year. We have that system that forms well north of Leeward Islands, the one that forms, and it goes towards the Florida coast, and then it recurves out to sea without really making landfall. And then we have one that HQ is tracing now that goes towards the Bahamas, and then it either hits South or North Carolina, or it skims the Carolinas, definitely affecting it because even if it skims the coast, it barely makes landfall. It's still landfall. It's bad. And even if it doesn't make landfall, if it gets close enough to the coast, it's still gonna affect it because again, hurricanes and even tropical storms are big. And then
Mm-hmm.
it goes towards the northeast, and like Irene, it goes back over sea, and then it makes another landfall around New Jersey. And then we could have the recurves maybe going towards like Newfoundland or Bermuda.
Mm-hmm. And of course, there's always that chance for some recurves further out to sea as well. That's kind of a given any year.
Yes.
to see some storms doing that. And usually those are fish storms with minimal impacts. So those are the kind of storms most people like to see.
Yeah.
So this is another forecast from Sebastian.
You want
I'll
to
let
talk?
you talk
Do you
about
want
it.
to talk about this one?
Hmm?
Do you want to talk about this one?
Sure. So as you can see here, this is where we are looking at the potential risk areas, and Sebastian is highlighting the highest risk areas to be in the northeast and mid-Atlantic of the United States, and even portions of the northern southeast coastline, such as South Carolina, North Carolina, all the way up into Massachusetts and Connecticut. This is where one of our highest risk areas may be, because a lot of those storms could be getting in that recurving action right along the coastline. And then
And
another
even
major risk area will be in the Bahamas. So you can see here, it's the Bahamas are kind of right in the path of a lot of those storm tracks where those might line up. So storms heading towards the East Coast um, will likely head straight through the Bahamas, putting them also in a considerable risk. And then
yeah, and even then, even oh, sorry.
some other high risk areas include the eastern Florida coastline, the Florida Panhandle, and possibly the Yucatan and portions of southern Texas and northern Mexico. Now, along the Florida east coastline, you can see a lot of those storm tracks that do move up the coast could get very close to that Florida coastline, which places them at a high risk as well. A little bit lower of a risk, but there is that probability that some storms could impact the coastline there, and especially in that region of the Atlantic, waters can be very warm, so that's an area we will have to be watching.
Yeah, and not even and the Northeast, for example, they're not only at a highest risk for systems getting really close to the coast. That again, the storms are big. Storms are obviously tropical storms and hurricanes are big. So even when it gets really close to the coast, puts you at a high risk of at least tropical storm impacts or even more. But
Mm-hmm.
a lot of much higher risk for even landfalls, like we saw with Irene.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you could see a storm could make landfall in South or North Carolina and move right up the coast, kind of partially weakening, but also moving relatively quickly. So those impacts can kind of sustain themselves into the
And they
Northeast.
go,
So that will definitely be something we have to watch.
yeah, or we saw like with Irene, like it hit the Carolinas, it can go back over the ocean, and it's not even it like skims the Carolinas, so it doesn't weaken too much. But then it goes back over the ocean, it gains back some of its momentum, and makes another landfall, like Irene did, like around New Jersey, I think it was.
Mm-hmm. And then also, we have to be watching the some portions of the Gulf of Mexico, especially. We could be seeing, of course, a little bit less active, but there is still a chance for some storms heading into the Gulf of Mexico, possibly hitting the Gulf Coast of Florida um, in the north, as well as the Yucatan. I think the Yucatan is somewhere that kind of sticks out that we will have to be watching. And any storm that does hit the Yucatan possibly could impact portions of Texas as they enter the Gulf of Mexico. So those are some other areas we will have to be watching this season.
Yes.
So now this is our chance of at least tropical storm force conditions. So Sebastian, I'll let you talk about this one.
Okay, I'll talk about the Gulf, and then you'll talk about the East Coast.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the very southern Texas is at among the highest risks for tropical storm conditions, at least. Um, this year. So that, again, this is the chance of tropical storm conditions and or more. But again, we're going to focus on at least tropical storm conditions because that's all it takes to be bad. For all the coastal counties. So the second to darkest red, 35 to 45% chance. Southern Texas due to that Yucatan Texas track, and then as we go more north, it goes down. So up and towards northern Texas, it's only about a 25 to 30% chance to a moderate risk, and that central Gulf around Louisiana among the lowest risk in the Gulf. And then again, that Florida Panhandle track we've shown around Panama City, Apalachicola, so we can have up to a 35 to 45% chance of the coastal counties getting impacts there. And then towards the Florida Big Bend in Tampa, only below a 15% chance, as I do not really think we're going to see recurves towards there. And then I'll hand it off to HQ for the East Coast.
Mm-hmm. So for the East Coast, you could see starting out in the East Coast of Florida, you could see we have that risk as highlighted earlier here along the East Coast. So some of those storm tracks that do kind of progress up the East Coast, kind of in a motion like this, could kind of skirt the coast of Florida, possibly bring tropical storm force conditions or greater to the East Coast, most notably. So I feel like the East Coast is an area that in Florida we will have to be watching the most, at least in my opinion. And then you can see as we slowly progress northward, there's a small area here in Georgia and far northern Florida where the risk is lowest. This is kind of in this little bend area, so just naturally the chance is a bit lower. But as we progress northward, you can see the chance does increase. You can see in South Carolina, we have a 25 to 30% chance, and then as we head into the Carolinas, that chance it goes all the way up to 45 to 55%, because we could be seeing again some of those recurves here, potentially making landfall in the Carolinas or just skirting by, bringing possibly some substantial impacts to those areas. And then as we head into the mid-Atlantic, you can see we also have a pretty great risk. It's a 35 to 45% chance of tropical storm force conditions. We could be seeing some of those storms either moving through North Carolina and up the coast, or just skirting by the coast, possibly bring tropical storm force conditions to the coastline. And then in New England and Long Island, we have a bit of a lower risk, but still notable, 30 to 35% chance of tropical storm force conditions. And then in Massachusetts, that's where that risk starts to gradually trickle down. You can see 25 to 30% for Boston and Cape Cod. And then as you head northward, 15 to 25% chance in portions of Maine and New Hampshire. And then finally a 15% in the far north or southeastern portion of Maine.
Okay, and also, believe it or not, I do think the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast surrounding Jersey, New York, Delaware, I do think they have a higher risk on the Florida East Coast this year because, at least on the analogs, while storms skirt by the East Coast, the landfall chances are actually higher based on the analogs for the Mid-Atlantic. So I am thinking that while they both are in the 35 to 45% chance, I'm thinking the Florida East Coast is more towards that 35% chance, and the Mid Atlantic is both more towards that 45% chance. Though both are still high, and that while it's below 50%. So while you might be thinking, hey, that's not high, we are still in February, and also even then we cannot predict hurricane tracks. So really, literally anything above 25% is technically very high.
Mm-hmm. All right, now moving on to the Atlantic overview. I'll let you talk about this one.
So it's not very detailed. We'll get it more detailed as we go closer, but some notable activity due to the Yucatan tracts and maybe Texas and the Caribbean, and below average storms due to shear in the MDR. Though more north in the MDR, we're going to have a lot of activity, and not everywhere in that red is a hot spot. That is just saying that's where the tracks are mainly going to be. That is not the hot spots. The hot spots we showed earlier, the Mid Atlantic and the Carolinas, and some other areas. But really, this just shows that the storms are going to recurve a lot, but also stuff up the East Coast making landfall anywhere from the Carolinas into the Northeast and into the Eastern Gulf of
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
All right. Did I just go back?
Yeah.
All right. Yep. So thank you for watching this video. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. But definitely go check out Sebastian's channel. I just got the notification. His premiere just began 1 minute ago. So if you want to check that out, feel free to do that. But yeah, please subscribe to both my channel and Sebastian's channel.